disponível no YouTube, né? E vocês vão poder acessar, né, a qualquer momento, né? Usar em aulas, por sinal, eu também vou usar isso daqui nas minhas aulas. E eu não posso deixar de agradecer, né, não só, como eu disse, os autores, debatedores, mas também a Ana Célia, o Colégio Brasileiro, né, por estar promovendo esse evento. Eu não posso também deixar de agradecer a revisão técnica de tradução do Lisandro Abulatife, né, que fez a revisão da tradução. A tradução foi feita por inteligência artificial, mas houve uma revisão técnica humana muito cuidadosa do Lisandro e toda a equipe técnica, né, que está fazendo o apoio desse evento. Então, sem mais delongas, eu vou passar já a palavra para os autores e nós prevemos aí cerca de 40 a 45 minutos para os três autores explorarem, né, e apresentarem o livro para o público brasileiro.
Great. Thank you so much. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm Rainer Kattel. I'm a professor at University College London and Taltech in Estonia, and I have my two colleagues here online as well, Wolfgang Drechsler and Erkki Karo, and I'm sure they will introduce themselves as they speak as well. So first of all, I think we are incredibly grateful for Alexandre and Enap, of course, taking the initiative and making it also freely available. Which is great and very much, of course, with a time. But that also means that we can't show you like the physical version of the book because it's online available. So I can show you the English version of the book. And so this is that came out 3 years ago, I think by now. So it's almost exactly 3 years. And as we will talk about it today as well, of course, these 3 years have been quite a roller coaster for people who are thinking about the state and innovation. So obviously, we are in that sense very, very lucky that I think our book is still very timely. But of course, there are also changes that we have to and can discuss, nonetheless in the Brazilian context. So the way we will talk about the book is because 3 authors, all of us will speak about certain aspects of the book. So I will do a bit of like an overall introduction to the book, what is in there. Then we will have Wolfgang. He'll talk about what has happened with the reception of the book, translations, various sort of discussions it has initiated, I guess, in the world as well. And then Erkki will talk about what would be right differently today, knowing everything that has followed the publication of the book, but not because of the book, but maybe despite of it. Anyway, and then I'll do a bit of like before we give the floor to our discussions in Brazil. I'll try to contextualize it in the Brazilian context as well. Although of course Ana Célia and João are much better at that, and we are very grateful to you, Ana Célia and João as well, for taking the time not only to be here today, but also of course that you wrote wonderful prefaces to the book. So. Quickly, what is this book about? As you know, the title says it in many ways, all innovation needs bureaucracy. And of course, or that's the subtitle. And we very much sort of course, on purpose try to be slightly provocative, if you will, because everybody who talks about innovation would say bureaucracy is one of the problems that we don't have enough innovation. And of course, what we try to do is to show that they always go together. If you want to have any form of innovation, you have to have an organization, you have to have an implementation of your ideas somewhere going along. And in many ways, because there are 3 authors, there is also like three sections of the book. No, but we actually didn't write them separately, but it is very much an interwoven idea. But there are like 3 sections of the book, and depending on your interest in innovation and public administration, you might want to steer yourself to those sections as well. So if you look at the initial first 2 chapters really are more broader overall public administration theorizing, if you will. So it's not only about innovation, but it's more broadly about the question why governments actually change their organizational shapes, why this change happens. Because we all know there is this wonderful theorizing by Max Weber around this idea, what a good organization might look like and things like that. And what we, of course, as Alexandre mentioned as well, we argue that you not only need an expert-driven, stability-focused bureaucracy, but you also need a bureaucracy that changes. So how does this actually happen the change that might be driven by geopolitics, might be driven by technology or climate change or anything in the society that might needs to not only to react to, but also to try to anticipate that change. And so that the first part of the book kind of theorizes that why this is important to have this concept of agile stability. Not only stability is important, but also the agility in public sector. And in many ways, we again go back to Max Weber, of course, and he has this wonderful idea of not only the legal, rational form of bureaucracy that we all know so well. And of course, in Brazil, you know very well, because this is in many ways your foundation since a long time. But also Max Weber, of course, talked about, you know, what he called like charismatic individuals, and what we then translate into these charismatic organizations. And our broader theory of change in public administration really is that governments are also always trying to anticipate and understand and shape the future. And for that, they very often try to create new forms of organizations that very often might be slightly outside of the Weberian structures, but then the Weberian structure absorbs those organizations, takes on those functions, like central banks. If you go back 150 years ago, there was no central bank, for instance. It was created as something of a loose public-private partnership that now, of course, it's unimaginable to think of a government without a very strong, powerful, very Weberian central bank or an agency. So if you look around the world, central banks are very, very standardized in terms of what they do, how they hire people, their job descriptions, all of that. It's extremely standardized. So it's one example. And this is what the sort of the first part of the book does, is to essentially offer this theory of agile stability and arguing that this is how public organizations are not only reacting, but also shaping the changes around the world and around them as well. And then the second part almost uses this innovation policy, industrial policy, science and technology policy world as an example of this theory. And so we go through global regions, Europe, US, and Asia, and look how over the last really 150 years, this sort of balancing between agility and stability in science, technology, innovation landscape has happened. How in the US, how in European, how in Asian context, governments have actually constantly evolved and changed what they do, not only in terms of policy, but particularly in terms of implementation. So how do they get smart people to work for government? How do they promote? How do they evaluate policies? How do they collaborate? All of those things. And we use the sort of the center part of the book really to exemplify almost this on the example of industrial and innovation policies. And then the last part of the book, really one of the half chapters, if you will, is trying to look ahead. What does this mean of having this theory of agile stability? What does this mean of understanding the history of science, technology, and industrial policy landscape through this concept? And what do we see looking ahead? How are governments now sort of dealing with it? And maybe that's the part of the book we might have rewritten in a slightly differently, knowing, but maybe not, knowing what has happened in the world now. But we sort of offer this idea that like a neo-Weberian agency, so that there is still, you have this sort of Weberian core of competence and stability. And of course, you can argue that there's nothing more as valuable in today's world as actually public sector that can deliver basic services and has these capacities to actually think ahead as well. And so, yeah, we call it the neo-Weberian agencies in a way that how they are combining these new and anticipating new trends and challenges, particularly what kind of tools they use. And we look at the examples of digital agencies, public labs and design agencies. And we see that this is, or we predict that this kind of a neo-Weberian agency is perhaps very important future shape of public organizations, because they are in one agency in many ways try to combine these agile and stable functions. And of course, Brazil is a very interesting example of that, because you have a very strongly Napoleonic Weberian system at the core of civil service and the way policies are done. And of course, in that sense, it's a really interesting case study for our book as well going ahead. But I'll now give floor to Wolfgang to take it from here, how the book has sort of been received globally, as it were. And you can introduce yourself as well. Thank you so far.
Thank you, Rainer. And for me, it's very easy to introduce myself because I just flip-flop what Rainer said. That means I'm a professor mainly at Caltech's Norksey department, but also an honorary professor at UCL IIPP. So it's just the reversal. And my third appointment is that I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Indonesia. And the lot has fallen to me to talk a bit about how the book has done in the last 3 years, which were 3 very big years, if you will. And the first thing I would like to mention here is that what really pushed the book in the general imagination is that it actually won an award from the Academy of Management in the United States, the Terry Award, which goes for the best general management book in the last 2 years. And I can really say this is not an anecdote, that for all 3 of us, when we got the mail that we received the award, we thought it was some form of scam, some form of phishing, because we had really not counted on that. In fact, the almost Calvinist minimalism for which Rainer is famous means that we did not push this book for any awards ourselves, nor for any reviews, although that has become very usual, because that's not his style. And so this award came out of the blue because neither of us, neither Erkki nor Rainer nor myself, are active in the Academy of Management. And usually that's, you know, to have such a big award and then for a public sector management book, I mean, there are people who have worked here for 25 years, given terrible papers and terrible committees and stuff like that, and now they get nothing, and we, who have nothing to do with this, get this award. This was pretty amazing. But what was interesting, I thought, was that from a general management perspective, this was taken up, again, with a specific emphasis also on the entrepreneurial state, which is something that, although it is so important as a concept, has not made it to them. And that really pushed the book more on the agenda than we had thought or perhaps even hoped. The same with the reviews. So there has been a nice set of reviews. What was interesting is that the not so friendly reviews were first, but not many, 1 or 2, just that were critical. And for a book like that, you expect a certain kind of reviews. One shouldn't judge reviews ad hominem, but if it's from a real business lobby perspective that thinks that the state should stay out of everything, of course, people like that are not going to like this book. What I thought is very important, if I follow up on Rainer's nutshelling, is what the reviews did. And again, once you write and publish such a book, it's taken up by people, and they don't look what is the intention of the authors, but what does the text do for them? And as Rainer has outlined, the point of the book was to talk about the implementation of innovation policy. That means specifically the agile stability was an optimal way, an optimal modus operandi for innovation departments in whatever bigger ministry or organization this was. But what happened in the review process is that a lot of people actually took this concept and said, never mind innovation bureaucracies, but agile stability, that sounds like a really good way of how the public sector should be organized generally. So this, again, was not our argument. We didn't try to make this argument or broaden it. We really talked about innovation bureaucracies, but the way people have read the book and used the book was beyond that, and for bureaucracy generally, which is very nice if people generalize your theory, because you don't have to prove this then, because you know, you never claimed such a thing, but people just take it. And this is also very interesting of how the book was used in the translations. So there have been 5 translations, and the one we are discussing currently, the Brazilian Portuguese one, is the one in the middle. It's the 3rd. So the first one was into Finnish, which was in that sense funny, in that all Finns speak English, and they are perhaps the one country that needs it the least, because they are, there is a very large group of people who know what innovation policy is about, and they have been very good. Right now, they aren't because of politics, but in principle, there is a big critical mass. This was in a, if you will, in a press with a left slant, politically speaking, you know, trade union, social democrat. And that is a book, however, that is meant for people to buy. You know, it's not a training book, but it's a purchasing book. And it's as such produced. And we had a very nice book launch with 2 elements, one with stakeholders, one for the general public in Helsinki. And there was a long blog by the Finnish chairman of the Science and Technology Committee, who looked at that really from a policy perspective and said, this is a book that can give hope for, if you will, the fantasy that the global left needs in order to be constructive and yet with ideas. There has been recently, I think, was it a Substack thing or so by Sergej Maldon in saying that there was a problem with the left in not having enough ideas. And in a way, what this Finnish politician said is that this book is giving this. And again, that was not necessarily our intention, but it's very nice to read. The second translation for Indonesia, which, as you know, is a very important country. It's very often mentioned together with Brazil because it's very large. Actually, it's the 4th largest country in the earth, and it kind of flies under everybody's radar. If you ask people what are the 4 biggest nations, they usually bring the top 3 and forget Indonesia. But it's a very important country. And here, the translation has a similar role as in Brazil, in that the primary purpose is civil service, senior civil service training. That means the people who pioneered that come from a system setup that is quite similar to Enap. That means it's a tool to tell senior civil servants how this can and should operate. And what was quite surprising for us, although it was published in the university press, by the way, Gajah Mada University Press, is that the preface for the Indonesian edition was actually written by the Minister of PA Reform. That was surprising because the current government was actually, it seems they were a bit shifting away from what we are doing, but they still kind of owned this book. Then now we have the Portuguese translation, for which we are very, very grateful. And special thanks again, of course, to Alexandre for this initiative, for spearheading it, because there's always these champions who go and run with the translation, and without them, in the end, nothing happens. And the next translation that is already printed, that means the copies are already at the press in hardcover, but have not been delivered yet, is in China. And of course, what could be more important than what is in the end an innovation policy book for China? And in fact, that right now in the current situation, the Chinese would look even at any kind of Western book of how to do industrial policy is in a way almost ironic, right? Because we should learn from that. Rainer mentioned the various Asian things we happened, the Chinese version. Somehow our discussion of Taiwanese policy disappeared, but that is something that you know before if you go into this environment. If you have a problem with that, don't do a Chinese translation, because books on PA will be reviewed by the government and they will say what they like and what they don't like. However, it came out with a press whose name I really like, and that is the Truth and Wisdom Publishing House in Shanghai. What could be nicer than Truth and Wisdom? And again, there will be a big book launch, both in Shanghai and in Xi'an. You know, there's Chinese launches with dry ice and symphony playing and so on. But while it is a commercial press, it is, of course, geared again at the market of people dealing with this. And then the final translation, and this is the last thing I want to mention, is the German one, on which I was even working this morning. So this will be out with Metropolis Press here in Marburg, which is famous for heterodox. It's, if you will, a junior Elgar publishers in Germany, if you will. That's the best comparison. And through this, we were then going, because in the translation, it was first made by AI, and then we go through it. And this is exactly what Rainer said. So we go through the text and we see what can still stand and what cannot stand. And then we decided to only update the exact text very sparsely, only where it's needed, you know, to say something, and then have an epilogue in which we look at how the things would be today. There, in the beginning, there was not that much about digital. There was not that much about China, but obviously enough that there is a Chinese translation. If you look at it now, it seems that what they say is geopolitical and technological shifts, which is a polite way of saying Trump and AI. And that is something that you a little bit have to talk about. But what we definitely see is that you can cope in our context. And so let's see how this chapter is going. Rainer is the one who did the Weber chapter, or the Weber discussion in the original book, talking about Weber's 3 ways of legitimate government and how you can justify innovation policy. You know, the historical, or the traditional, the charismatic, and the legal rational. But if you do that, how can you understand the old leading power of the West, the United States today? Because it is actually neither of the 3. So, but what you can do is you go back to Max Weber's Herrschaft book, and in Patrimonialism, when discussing, if you will, medieval administration, all of a sudden you find Weber discussing a system in which loyalty is more important than competence. And so all of a sudden, what I mean is the world has absolutely changed, as Rainer says, but the general framework we have to discuss it has fortunately or unfortunately stayed the same. But as far as these actual changes is concerned, this is something where I'd like to give the word to Erkki, because he's going to talk about the challenges today. Thank you.
Okay, so hello also from my side. So my name is Erkki. I am the 3rd author of the book, and I come from Taltech, Talinn University of Technology, where I'm a professor of science and technology and also the head of the department. So I have like 2 hats. That I have been a student of both Wolfgang and Rainer, but I'm also sort of halfway their boss at the moment. So this is how it goes. But yeah, it's 3 generations of thinking together. My task here is really to elaborate with a few words, maybe the ideas of going further, or how would we rewrite the book. The first time we had this discussion of how to rewrite the book was during the original launch in 2022 in London. And then the obvious sort of discussion was that we don't have a chapter on digital and neither sustainability. And I think we still don't have them, right? And one could ask that, should we have written it, or maybe it's too early, or maybe actually these topics are not that different from what we were saying before, that they don't merit a separate chapter. But I think that 2 cases here about the challenges of sustainability or sustainability transitions, or however we label them, and the technological development, whether it's related to green technologies or AI, actually give us basically like 2 challenges to bureaucracies that we can see that how actually bureaucracy is able to cope with them. And what I mean by that is that if you think about the original waves of sustainability topics, especially in global West, global North, this was very much kind of a political push with green deals, with IRAs and stuff like that in US, which means that you had actually this kind of a huge expectation to lead, the public sector should lead large-scale socioeconomic transformations. Right. And what we have seen now, 5 years later, is that in many cases, this political mandate or legitimacy that was given to these ideas has to some extent, evaporated, at least in global West, right? So, the challenge for bureaucracy is actually to be in the middle there and make sense that maybe sometimes the political mandate or political direction is too radical, whether it's towards sustainability or towards something where Trump is going. But then the question becomes, how then civil service actually keeps the long-term view in it, right? And the second side is really when you think about both green technologies and AI, is actually that technology development is often not driven that much by political mandates or political directions, but it's actually the corporate and technological logic that leads you into rushing into something, right? So if you think about today's AI rush, who gets more data centers off the ground gets a better basis, or if you think about green transition and so on, who gets more green technologies out gets to a better position. But all of these kind of rushes to some extent lead again to some sort of fragilities or dangers that you either overinvest or you create too much energy dependence or whatnot, right? And here again, the question becomes, how can bureaucracies actually maintain some sort of a, let's say, middle ground there, that you don't run after the technology hypes, but you keep a sensible core when you try to implement policies. And I think if you think about these challenges and try to put our book into this, then I think the idea of these neo-Weberian agencies or neo-Weberian organizations actually still makes sense. One could argue, we would probably argue also with Rainer or Wolfgang whether we should talk about neo-Weberian agencies or whether we should talk about neo-Weberian ministries, right? So that what is actually the core of innovation bureaucracy in these situations, that for a long time we have separated policymaking from implementation and argued that, we can get better results through that. But I think facing this kind of political turmoil or political sort of uncertainties and hypes, and then at the same time also technology hypes, it is actually much more important to have also kind of policy making much more capable of having a long-term view and long-term capabilities around it. So it's not only about agencies, but it's the ministries, it's the ministerial planning bureaus. And one of these things that I have been thinking very much about is, and this goes back again to arguing that, one of the central elements of any kind of bureaucracy is ability to learn, right? And then the question becomes, so the ministries, planning organizations, and so on, how do you learn what works, what doesn't in these kind of turbulent times? And then having this kind of a neo-Weberian approach, but at the same time also bringing policymaking and implementation closer together again might actually be a tool how you improve your ability to learn and understand what works, what not. Because otherwise we end up having the world where everybody requires us quick responses and quick reactions, while implicitly we need to also have long-term planning, but or long-term vision, let's say, but we shouldn't have policy cycles that like 7 or 8 years before we learn whether an idea works, right? So that we have this challenge within the bureaucracies in this context to have the two sides together, having a long-term view, but also being able to learn quickly. So I think the neo-Weberian concept is not about only innovation agencies, but this can be indeed become a horizontal tool that different types of government ministries and agencies adopt when they think about public policies and how to go forward. And I think this is something that at least in Global West we see. As my side sort of activity currently, I am also working together with European Commission's Director General on Industrial Policy. And when I talk to the civil servants there, they describe their policy challenge very simply, is that, we used to do industrial policy through 2 years of planning, 3 years of planning, maybe 5 years of planning. And then we had to fundraise, and then we had to do an investment or a regulation, and then we had to learn whether this works or not. And now we have 3 days to decide how do we deal with a AI factory, how do we deal with a rare magnets factory, should we invest in them, should we nationalize some of them, and so forth. So the time cycle has become much quicker, and we cannot anymore allow this kind of a division between policy design and implementation. But at the same time, we need to keep together this ability to have a long-term planning or vision setting as well as quick responses. So I think this, to me at least, I feel that this is always the challenge with authors, is that you see your idea everywhere. But at least I think that the argument is still there, that the concept of agile stability and neo-Weberian agencies or organizations is, I think, something that we shouldn't ditch in the next version of books, but elaborate much more broadly, right? And I think I will finish from my side in here as well. And I think Rainer wants to pick up something, right?
Yeah. Thank you, both Wolfgang and Erkki, for these wonderful summaries of what's going on with the book globally and where the debate is. And before I give the floor to our local, as it were, I mean, we're not there really. And I know João is not in Brazil either. So everybody's somewhere else. But just to look at maybe ahead bit towards Brazilian debate around the book and the topics of the book, I think one thing that I think is quite noticeable is that we don't maybe pay as much attention to politics as perhaps is relevant in the Brazilian context for obvious reasons. And I think the issue that maybe Brazil was in many ways a forerunner of this sort of what we can call democratic backsliding, and then the dangers of that, and how can a bureaucracy be almost sort of build resilience or do that, I think is a very Brazilian context. And I think this is something that maybe could have been sort of more in the book. And I think this is what also Erkki in many ways mentioned, this idea that we are now entered the world, maybe not of agility, but of urgency, where a lot of things are very urgent, both in terms of technology, but also where crises are very urgent. And crisis can of course be very often then be weaponized in social media context, and particularly by the more populist politicians. And I think there is something very interesting there, where Brazilian context, of course, is very interesting to learn from, and to see how we can how this sort of this idea of financial stability should also be more looking at politics and the level of politics, and not the role of politics playing around public sector organizations. And I think in many ways, of course, Brazilian context is also very interesting, the way you have tried to counteract this backsliding by hiring more civil servants during the second Lula government, 6,000 new civil servants, and they are all being then trained by Enap, which of course is a wonderful case of bringing and building capacity that is hopefully long-term, and it's not so easy to undermine. But then, of course, you look at what Trump is doing and cutting entire agencies, you see that there is a certain you can argue cynicism about that. It's not just cutting budgets, but actually slashing entire agencies, which is probably indeed very much a new world we have to face, that other politicians might want to maybe replicate, just cut the entire agency for foreign aid, and it's become more normal. So I think this sort of democratic backsliding and these issues have become really, really important around in Brazil, but also I think our book can be seen in this context as well, how it is sort of the core of civil service, the core values of civil service, the core how you build civil service are still very important, and very much in the Bavarian vein, if you will, that it's about expertise. But I think I really like the way Enap is trying to, and Brazilian government is trying to do it, is to have strong diversity in the new civil servant hires, make sure that they come from different backgrounds geographically, but also gender, race, all of those things, which is really the way to rejuvenate in many ways the Weberian idea. And I think the other thing I think in the Brazilian context is of course very interesting is, since you are in this very Napoleonic context as a governance structure, whereas one side is the strong top-down culture of policymaking, but also of course the public sector organization law that really governs all public organizations, that is since 1960s hasn't really changed. And I think our book did help a bit as well to revive these debates around how do you and why you need to have a new legal basis for public organizations to be perhaps more diverse and consciously diverse. Because if you have more diverse organizations in public sector, you can also be more resilient, because you have different types of organizations that can pick up different threats and challenges in a different speed. So if you are a big development bank, for instance, like João would know very well from his days in BNDES, maybe you cannot act in an agile way, because you have to follow the procedure and the law, and otherwise you might be punished. But if you are a city, for instance, you can be reacting much more quickly. So having this new public sector law, I think, might be really important for Brazil. And this is, I think, where our book can be helpful to show how you could think of this public organizations in a different way. And I think as Erkki mentioned it, of course, here I have to again mention Alexandre's work around neo-Weberian governance, really. I think Alexandre has really brought this idea of neo-Weberian state into Brazilian discussions, and shown why Brazil particularly is well suited to be analyzed as a neo-Weberian state. And so again, I think this is where our book can be of help, I think, to understand what does it mean to be a neo-Weberian state? What does it mean to be a neo-Weberian organization? What does it mean to be a neo-Weberian ministry, for instance? Or what does it mean to build neo-Weberian training programs? And so I think that this is where all of those things come together. But I think we have been talking enough, and the authors of the book, and we have wonderful discussions here by Célia and João. So maybe I give the floor to you first, Célia, to give your reaction. And thank you again, of course.
I think João should speak before me. Desculpa.
Oh, really?
Não, por favor.
Did I not read the order of the day? What was the agreement? Sorry,
Alexandre.
Acho melhor o João, né, que é o nosso convidado, né, porque a Ana Célia é promotora e tem que falar em português, João, porque no YouTube está sendo em português. Tá? Senão eles vão traduzir o que você está falando.
Muito bem.
Obrigado, João, por estar aqui com a gente.
Muito obrigado, e é bom estar com amigos. Quando a gente ainda estava na sala fechada, eu disse a Wolfgang e Erkki que o mais importante nesse livro foi que esse é um livro instigante. Então, meus comentários vão na linha do que ele me provocou. Eu vou ser bem específico em torno a 7 pontos, então eles vão ser muito específicos para ver qual a reação de vocês. O primeiro, eu tenho um amigo que me chamou a atenção sobre o fato de o termo burocracia estar no título. Isso porque, no Brasil em particular, tem uma certa mistura entre burocratismo e burocracia. E aqui tem um caso. Uma vez um ministro pediu a outro ministro de administração pública que ele desse opinião sobre uma proposta de um regulamento de alfândega que ele havia elaborado e tinham 900 itens, artigos. E a resposta desse ministro, Hélio Beltrão, foi: um regulamento deste tamanho, ele é muito bom para um contrabandista, porque o honesto não consegue cumprir. E no Brasil tem essa tensão. Então, é só um chamado de atenção a gente realmente marcar que burocracia é muito diferente do burocratismo. Isso é um comentário. Sobre agora mais específico, uma primeira pergunta é: em que medida que o conceito de capabilities, de state capabilities, de capacitações estatais, ele pode ser trabalhado genericamente, ou se essas capacitações elas não são específicas a contexto, específica a tempo, local, de modo que os analistas de capacitações eles podem ter algum tipo. Como é que um analista organizaria seu trabalho, tanto do ponto de vista dos fatores internos a uma burocracia, como dos fatores que condicionam uma burocracia ou o Estado a agir? Esse é o primeiro ponto. O segundo é uma reflexão quase que aqui associada ao final de vocês. Supondo que um Estado, em um país em desenvolvimento, um Estado tenha a sua capacidade inovadora, mas frente a todos esses desafios que nós estamos enfrentando, Erkki mencionou 2, de sustentabilidade do digital. Como é que um país pode organizar mesmo uma burocracia inovadora, como é que ele pode organizar uma política inovadora, dado o contexto de uma verdadeira concorrência por política industrial por parte dos países ricos em recursos? Qual o espaço? como uma burocracia inovadora deveria explorar espaços nesse contexto tanto de incerteza. O terceiro tem a ver com isso. O Erkki mencionou, né, o digital e a sustentabilidade, que são áreas sobre as quais a política deveria agir. A diferença é que estas áreas são muito desconhecidas e o desenho de uma burocracia também deveria ser associado a essas mudanças. A sustentabilidade e o digital vão afetar a organização do Estado. Dado que esse é um assunto ainda desconhecido, nós estamos na área de incerteza, como é que nós podemos pensar em como um Estado deve se organizar? O quarto ponto é o que Rainer mencionou, é a tensão entre a política e o political dimension e a policy dimension, né? São duas dimensões que, em português, infelizmente, a gente só tem um termo, política. No inglês é possível separar. Mas a tensão entre essas duas dimensões, realmente, Rainer, já que você começou a explorar esse tema, em que medida que não há um trabalho aí a ser feito? Nessa linha, o que vocês acham? Esse é o penúltimo ponto. O que vocês acham que deveria ser? O livro de vocês é um trabalho trilha, ele define caminhos para a investigação. Quais deveriam ser os temas e áreas de pesquisa futura que vocês julgam relevantes? E se ele é aplicado genericamente ou se é necessário levar em consideração o que eu tinha dito anteriormente de contextos. O Rainer começou a falar de cidade versus Estado, mas mesmo a cidade pode ser muito complexa, né? E, finalmente, esse é um tema que me preocupa. É o seguinte, o Estado contraditório. Toda ação pública ela tem uma dimensão, supondo que ela seja efetivada, implementada, ela tem uma dimensão, entre aspas, positiva, partindo de algum desejo e algum design de se influenciar um conjunto de beneficiários numa determinada direção. Este conjunto de beneficiários, ok? Esse é o lado, digamos, positivo. No entanto, na maioria das ações do Estado, há um outro lado. Ao lado da reação, da ação e da reação de uma ação do Estado. Ele é sempre contraditório. Ele nunca é completamente... Como tratar um Estado contraditório, inerentemente contraditório, na avaliação de vocês de qual deveria ser o marco de referência para a gente trabalhar nisso? Eu dou um exemplo. Se você financiar uma hidrelétrica, essa hidrelétrica gera energia que atende a beneficiários, mas, ao mesmo tempo, afeta o meio ambiente local com todas as suas consequências, mesmo que sejam tomadas todas as ações de mitigação, é uma ação que vai mudar alguma coisa. É isso, gente. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade. Alexandre, pela oportunidade que vocês me deram. Parabéns, realmente. Espero que isso seja uma agenda aí na Enap super interessante. E Ana Célia, como sempre, no CBAE, poxa, super ligada nos temas mais importantes. E a todos que estão aqui por detrás aqui do backroom por terem facilitado essa iniciativa. Muito obrigado.
Nós que agradecemos, João, a sua participação, né, e os comentários. Como foram 7 pontos super interessantes, com alguma densidade, né, que o João apresentou, eu acho melhor a gente voltar para os comentários, né, dos 3 autores e depois a gente ouve a Ana Célia, ok? Então, a ordem fica aí com vocês. Não sei quem de vocês quer começar a comentar.
So let me begin to answer. I mean, it of course takes some coordination that when these many brilliant questions come, the three of us now needed to split off who's answering what. And I think it's pretty agile that we were able to do that. This is a book that is very much our book. That means it's really a synthesis of what these three authors wrote. But on the other hand, it is still true that there are certain themes or sections that can be attributed to individual authors. And so let me answer the zero question, namely the one on bureaucracy and bureaucratism first, which was kind of outside, but it's a very important one. And, this is a quite interesting one from a publishing technical perspective, because this innovation bureaucracy thing, this is a provocative, or some people say controversial, way of putting it. But on the other hand, as a famous German author said, is our lives long enough that we should deal with anything that is not controversial? I mean, do we have time for trivial truths, right? So innovation bureaucracy is in a certain sense an oxymoron, but why we have this, how to make an entrepreneurial state, why innovation needs bureaucracy in the end, this is what you call an academic trade book. That means a book published by a university publisher that actually wants to sell books. And so the decision on the title actually rests with the publisher. And the publishers probably would like to phrase titles a bit more directly and also controversially, so that it is kind of interesting, less nuanced and more direct, if you will. The thing, namely, is that Rainer, Erkki, and myself, by background, are PA scholars. And in PA, we use bureaucracy in a more or less neutral way. But the way this word emerged in any language, it was always meant as an insult. You bureaucrat is not a compliment in any language. So buroskratein, the rule of the bureau plat, right? That's where it comes from. It was always meant is that not the legitimate rulers like the kings and princes, although they're pretty illegitimate these days if I look to London, do the actual ruling, but the bureaucrats, the ministerial level does it. This is the point. So as João said, sometimes people will say, okay, but isn't that something that gives it a more negative drill? Yes, but that is partially the point to get the conversation starting. If you then look at it, you do realize that the context is meant as a neutral one. That means like PA scholars who use basically the term bureaucracy as synonymous with civil service. But this is only within the discussion frame of PA scholars. Yeah, people who don't have an MPA and up don't think so, but it's important to look at this, but it's very well put. And let me just jump ahead to the penultimate question by João. Maybe Erkki or Rainer also want to say something about it, but we did have a really nice presentation of the English original on invitation of Alexandre, in which I discussed the book actually with Célia. And we had 1 hour on the stage for this. Do you remember the inauguration of the new auditorium at this point? And one of the things that Célia mentioned, and that came up in the discussion that I find really important, is other than China, other than sustainability, other than digital and KI, one thing which I see as a future important agenda is that this book only tackles the very top performers in innovation policy and innovation bureaucracy. But some of the biggest interest has actually come from the runner-up countries, not the absolute tops, but exactly the ones one level before that. And the reason is that, of course, this is where you're particularly interesting in how to fix these questions. And you know, there is countries in Asia, there is countries in Latin America that would be very easy to name, and so on, which were there. And this is something that Célia suggested as one of the main research extensions of this book. And I would still say today, this, for me personally, is one of the most interesting and one of the most promising, not updates, but extensions. So thank you very much from my side. And I think for the second question, it would be Rainer.
Yeah, happy to. And then Erkki, you can whichever you want to address as well. But it's just the second one. Which João was. I think there is this kind of follows on what Wolfgang was saying about Celia's points about that. The book is very much at looking at the countries that were in many ways leading these developments, and of course, you very often get the question: innovation is fine and good, but we need to deliver like basic services. We the governments are not able to do that, and that sort of I think chimes very well with the question: how do you know when you walk into a public organization whether it's capable or not? Does it have a capacity or not? And of course, that's really the foundational problem of capacity and capability analysis in government, because we always know in hindsight, and sort of we looking back, we say, oh, they had it, they did well. And of course, we don't really address this challenge in the book. We sort of do case studies. We still look at very much in historical case studies. But I think looking ahead, this is where we can do more. And I know Enap is taking, with Alexandre's leadership, again, here steps as well to go from looking at sort of in hindsight and looking at proxies of capacity, looking in real time into organizations. And there are, AI does a lot of bad things, but it can also do a lot of good things because you can analyze with large language models lots of qualitative information at the same time. So there's lots of interesting possibilities to do more real-time analysis. And I think this can also be much more helpful than for countries that are not at the cutting edge, because then you can see almost like heat maps. Where are we strong? Where are we weaker? And you can start to address it in a quicker fashion, I think. And also in terms of like looking ahead or like the future pathways, I think mentioning already the political dimension, I think, is really interesting and important, but it's also interesting to think about like what is the job description of a politician look like these days, and things like that. So I think political regimes definitely play a huge role in that. But I think also, a lot of us are from public administration here, thinking about different public administration traditions and capacity, and how capacity is being molded by different institutions, from electoral cycles to local media to the way we actually have fiscal division of labor between local and central governments. So that's a lot to do with administrative tradition, which is very difficult to change, but actually might help us understand why certain capacities are evolving or not. So I would leave it there and then give floor to Erkki.
Okay, thanks. I will try to then answer a few of the middle questions regarding maybe then the organization and how to explore the spaces and the role of politics. So I think you could look at our case studies and make some conclusions from there. But I guess there is also one important element from the theory of our book that would argue is that, well, such question as capacity building or creating of the spaces and stuff like that this cannot be a designed reform or something like that. This is rather something that happens very contextually within the kind of political constraints, with our technological constraints and so forth. And from history, we just see that, if you have a strong mandate for some sort of a innovation-driven development in one or other sector, you are more likely to see countries pushing for a highly visible kind of politically insulated agencies or planning boards running these kind of innovation initiatives, as well as from where the new capabilities might come out. Whereas other cases where the political mandate might not be there, you would see the opposite, that actually these kind of initiatives that survive because they need to show first their success to survive, they might happen from more peripheral areas and domains, almost like, some Fred Block has called it like the hidden developmental state, or you could call it the hidden innovation bureaucracy, that in some cases you hide this within the kind of policy space. Now, but this relates very much, I think, to the sort of public administration research that meets sustainability challenges. And the argument there is that when you take these really huge wicked issues like dealing with sustainability or climate neutrality, well, you cannot really achieve climate neutrality so that nobody notices, right? But at the same time, you cannot really do also climate neutrality policies in the current political landscape, right? So what you have seen is, I think, especially in Europe, this kind of emergence of thinking around this idea of transformative government, right? Or transformative public administration as institutions that kind of, or public sector taking the role of having this long-term transformative vision. And I think there is like a merger between innovation thinking and public administration thinking here, because if you read OECD's work on science, technology, innovation policy for the last 4 or 5 years, it's also about transformative policies, right? And this is all about sort of bureaucracies or governments kind of taking a different role in society, right? And some people even argue that, bureaucrats need to, define public value differently and say that it's not just something that we see from human needs, but also planetary boundaries or whatever you take in as public interest, right? And this is something that people have tried to conceptualize. And then this needs to be translated into your training programs, into community building. So what you actually do is you build this from ground up, but not very much as a hidden activity, but more through education or things that you do in Enap as well, so that you raise the collective awareness of bureaucracy, that public interest needs to be defined in time and context. Of course, this when you look at the Western countries and the experiences, this is not really that easy, and this is where a lot of kind of, I guess, experimental research or co-development between practitioners and academics is needed, because in Europe there are many case studies now emerging is that where actually civil servants, when they have been mandated with transformative tasks, they actually themselves tone down the ambition, because they believe that politicians, even if they give them the mandate, don't really know the full implications, right? So I think it just requires much harder work on sort of getting the understanding what this transformative government needs. But I think the way to build these kind of capacities or capabilities is actually not doing them in one agency or not doing them in sort of hidden format, but actually through the collective action of bureaucracy that comes through education, through common ethos and value building and activities like that. So it becomes an horizontal activity, but not straight away doing a change, but building this kind of a collective wisdom for change. I think that's something I would argue here. But yeah, I think this is where I would also take other reflections and comments.
Excelente. Acredito que podemos passar para a Ana. Ana, por favor, seus comentários.
Muito obrigada pelo convite. É sempre um imenso prazer encontrar esses 3 autores formidáveis, meu amigo João Carlos e o Alexandre Gomide, que está sempre na fronteira, né, liderando esses debates na Enap, e que são tão relevantes. Então, eu vou fazer aqui meus comentários, espero não me estender demasiadamente. Eu queria começar dizendo que o livro Por que a Inovação Precisa de Burocracia constitui uma inflexão teórica e histórica decisiva no debate contemporâneo sobre o Estado empreendedor. Kattel, Drechsler e Karo resgatam, com uma rara densidade conceitual, o papel das burocracias públicas, não como entraves à criatividade, mas como estruturas institucionais que tornam possível a inovação e, portanto, o próprio desenvolvimento. Em um tempo em que o discurso da agilidade, do experimentalismo e da governança flexível tende a subestimar as exigências de coordenação, estabilidade e legitimidade, os autores nos convidam a repensar a burocracia como uma forma de inteligência coletiva do Estado, dotada de memória institucional, capacidade de aprendizado e vocação política. A força analítica da obra, como todos puderam ver, reside nessa articulação entre Weber e Schumpeter. De Weber, os autores extraem a dialética entre autoridade carismática e racional legal, reinterpretando-a como um movimento dinâmico entre redes carismáticas e organizações de especialistas. De Schumpeter deriva a noção de destruição criadora aplicada às instituições públicas, que se reinventam ao ritmo das transformações tecnológicas e sociais. Dessa síntese emerge, então, o conceito de estabilidade ágil, a ideia central do livro e uma formulação fecunda e robusta da sociologia institucional contemporânea. Trata-se da capacidade paradoxal das burocracias sustentarem simultaneamente continuidade e transformação, acumular rotinas e competências sem perder plasticidade e iniciativa. A inovação, sustentam os autores, é o produto desse equilíbrio delicado, não do improviso, mas da institucionalização paciente da experimentação. A trajetória histórica reconstruída nos capítulos 3 a 6 confere substância empírica a essa tese. O Estado empreendedor do pós-guerra, simbolizado pelo DARPA e pela NASA, pelas agências europeias e asiáticas de ciência e tecnologia, foi capaz de articular visão política, direção estratégica e robustez institucional. As décadas seguintes, sobre o impacto das reformas neoliberais e do gerencialismo, reduziram a inovação a instrumento de competitividade, despolitizando-a e corroendo as capacidades estatais de longo prazo. O retorno contemporâneo das missões, diante dos desafios globais como o clima, a desigualdade e a transição digital, reabre a possibilidade de reconstruir burocracias públicas com legitimidade, capacidade técnica e autonomia reflexiva. Esse movimento de reconstrução não é regressivo. Ele não propõe restaurar o modelo weberiano clássico, mas fundar um novo tipo de burocracia, neo-weberiana, nas palavras dos autores, capaz de combinar hierarquia meritocrática e redes colaborativas, planejamento de longo prazo e experimentação iterativa, estabilidade e agilidade. Essa síntese reflete uma compreensão sofisticada do Estado como sistema vivo, coevolutivo, em permanente interação com o setor produtivo, a ciência e a sociedade. Lido sobre a perspectiva brasileira, a obra oferece um horizonte de reflexão indispensável. Ela aponta para a necessidade de reconstruir capacidades estatais dinâmicas, tanto para planejar quanto para aprender, em contexto de demandas sociais complexas e crises sucessivas. O desafio não é apenas técnico, mas profundamente político. Recolocar o Estado no centro da estratégia de desenvolvimento, transformando a burocracia em vetor de inteligência coletiva e não em mera engrenagem administrativa. Kattel, Drechsler e Karo demonstram que a burocracia criativa, ou a burocracia com mística de missão, é o coração de qualquer projeto de futuro. A sua tese é provocadora. A inovação não floresce apesar da burocracia, mas por meio dela. O livro, assim, oferece uma leitura que combina erudição histórica, teoria institucional e compromisso normativo, uma rara contribuição para repensar o papel do Estado no século XXI e uma inspiração para a construção de um Estado brasileiro capaz de conjugar estabilidade e transformação, planejamento e imaginação. Para finalizar, eu gostaria de propor uma abordagem de futuros para a reflexão de por que o Estado empreendedor necessita da burocracia. A construção de cenários prospectivos, por exemplo, combinando missões que pensem as várias formas de mitigação da crise climática, por um lado, com o potencial da inteligência artificial para combinar soluções tecnológicas existentes e futuras, pode ser interessante para repensar as capacidades e capacitações dinâmicas necessárias a uma burocracia com estabilidade ágil. Os exercícios prospectivos ou de foresight, ao serem trazidos para o presente, adicionam uma nova dimensão às capacitações, a dimensão antecipatória. Governança antecipatória é um desafio cada vez mais presente para as políticas orientadas por missão. Não sabemos como capacitar o núcleo estratégico do Estado para desenvolver a governança antecipatória, mas temos certeza de que isso se torna cada vez mais necessário. Então, eram essas as minhas observações. E a última parte é realmente a pergunta: como introduzir essa dimensão da governança antecipatória nessa reflexão sobre a burocracia ágil, sobre os compromissos, sobre as missões? Então, fica como pergunta, indagação ou sugestão para os autores. Muito obrigado.
Excelente, Ana. Assino embaixo da sua análise. Realmente, vimos, né, todo o potencial do livro, a contribuição que pode trazer. Adorei. Então, eu devolvo os autores, né, comentarem.
Yeah, I think I can just only agree with you, Alexandre. This was a fantastic reflection on our book, of course, and thank you so much, Anna. I think such a nice summary and reflection, if you will, on the book as well, and so we are very grateful, of course, for you writing.
Basically, a summary. I did a
Yes.
summary. I really
Yeah, exactly.
kept the main ideas.
Exactly. No, that's brilliant. I don't know whether Wolfgang or Erkki, you want to say something, but we're good.
No, I mean, of course, it adds to the research agenda, as you said, as far as the anticipatory governance is concerned. But indeed, this is something we did not deal with in the book. And just like with the second-tier countries, you're proposing a true extension of it, and only something that we can definitely agree with. I mean, it's very worth thinking, writing, including, and so on. But you know, it doesn't change what we did, but it takes off from it in an extremely creative, promising, and important way. So thank you very, very much for that.
Indeed.
Erkki?
I think you want to add some.
No, I think nothing much to add. I guess the point, what you said, and the points were all good. So, and I agree with what Wolfgang and Rainer were mentioning also. Yeah, thanks a lot again for the comments.
Bom, nós temos espaço para responder algumas questões da audiência que podem fazer as questões pelo chat do YouTube, e eu passo aqui para os autores. Eu não sei quantas questões temos, o pessoal vai informar para a gente, mas enquanto isso, eu queria aproveitar aqui meu espaço privilegiado, né, também para fazer algumas perguntas para os autores. O Wolfgang, durante a fala dele, né, ele colocou um ponto e que eu venho refletindo sobre isso, né, que o conceito de estabilidade ágil que vocês desenvolveram, né, foi muito para o caso específico das burocracias de inovação, né? Quer dizer, vocês não pensaram na burocracia como um todo. E aí eu vou contar um pouco e queria ver a opinião de vocês, como que eu venho trabalhando isso, né, inspirado, né, pelos trabalhos de vocês, pelos trabalhos, né, que o Rainer vem desenvolvendo sobre capacidades dinâmicas e sobre a questão do Estado neo-weberiano. Apesar da nossa tradição napoleônica, né, de ser bem distinta, né, da tradição de vocês, né, da Finlândia, da Estônia, e mesmo a tradição inglesa, eu acho que há espaço, né, para a gente se inspirar nisso, porque muito se exige por causa do discurso da nova gestão pública, né, e o discurso contra a burocracia, né, que o conceito de estabilidade ágil, eu acho que pode ser colocado de uma maneira geral para inspirar reformas, no sentido que a gente pode desenvolver junto com as capacidades estatais clássicas, né, que mantêm, né, a capacidade de implementação das políticas públicas já decididas no nível político, né, que elas que garantem a implementação, as capacidades dinâmicas e no sentido do que a Ana colocou, sobre a capacidade de antecipação, né, a capacidade de ver o futuro, né, e da burocracia, né, como elemento de inteligência, né, de um papel do Estado para enfrentar as grandes transformações e os grandes desafios que a gente vive hoje, né, principalmente em um país como o Brasil, além dos grandes desafios globais, como mudança climática, a questão da desigualdade, que é uma questão brasileira muito forte, mas a questão da transição digital e, sobretudo, a falta de legitimidade que o Estado está tendo das democracias de entregar serviços públicos. Então, aí fica a minha pergunta: até que ponto vocês acham que o conceito de estabilidade ágil, sem eu cair no alargamento conceitual, né, do conceptual stretching, né, a gente pode adaptar para inspirar reformas suficientes no Brasil que veem esse papel estratégico do Estado e o papel importante, né, das burocracias, do serviço público, em estar lidando, né, com essas transformações, ao mesmo tempo que garante a continuidade dos serviços básicos que nós precisamos entregar, que né, os serviços, né, de seguridade, combate à desigualdade, mas nós temos aí essas transições climáticas, né, ecológica, climática e digital, que a burocracia tem que enfrentar isso. Então, eu gostaria de ouvir de vocês, né, sobre a potencialidade do conceito de estabilidade ágil para esses casos maiores e, sobretudo, para casos como países como o Brasil.
Yeah, let me start. But of course, dynamic capabilities are Reiner's topic. So I will just say something for 1 minute and then give the word right away to Reiner, if that's okay. The important thing, what you said, is you and me, we are one of the relatively few people who are in the actual Max Weber discourse for PA people. Most PA people, and let alone economists, actually don't read Weber and are not clear about what Weberianism really means. And as we have been discussing in the journal Max Weber Studies, which is really the, if you will, Weber geeks who deal with the original texts, is that there is different layers of what Weberianism means. And as we even say in the book explicitly, there is a descriptor of a world that is significantly structured by the bureaucratic arrangements, and necessarily so because of the complex dimensions of the mass industrial society in its late phase, even under the circumstances that we have, that in this way, it is absolutely legitimate to put Brazil and the successes that we've had of the Brazilian bureaucracy, even if it is Napoleonic, under the label of Weberianism in that sense. So even very historical, you know, my famous example is always the Marquês de Pombal, who even with the colonial administration was extremely dynamic, extremely development-oriented, and so on and so on. So I just think to just reduce to the Weberianism that we mean to the really Weberian countries, which in the end are German-speaking countries before the last turn of the century, is too little. But what that actually means is something that Reiner can explain better than me.
Yeah, thank you. I would take Alexandre's question in a way that even in the book, of course, we have this conceptual layer of capacities and capabilities. That is really the way to unpick, if you will, the sort of agile stability, because, you know, agile stability can mean many different things in different contexts. And also, of course, even in the same country, in different sectors, it might look very different, right? So hence the sort of focus of trying to understand broader, like structural capacities of a country, which have very much to do with the administrative tradition and broader issues like that. And then, of course, you can look into more sort of routine organizational ways of working on an everyday basis. And then on top of that, we're sort of looking at this dynamic capabilities of changes and adaptation and transformation. So I think that's really the way to go about it, I think, is that the books really develops this sort of a capacity capability approach that, you know, now we have taken much further here, of course, looking at cities and trying to develop those measurement or evaluation methodologies. And I know that you, Alexandre, will do that in Brazilian context around state-owned enterprises, which is, of course, in a way, a perfect example, because these are enterprises in a market context. So they have definitely also firm level capabilities, but they also have capabilities as public organizations. So they are a really interesting hybrid form of that. But I think overall, of course, I think there's only probably one area where you perhaps don't need that much this sort of agile stability thinking, which is maybe big infrastructure. If you build big infrastructure, this is very expertise driven and very much driven by huge political essentially capacity to have those reforms, and building railways, new cities, all that typically is a very sort of engineering and political agenda as well. But I think if you look at public services, anything like that, really you can apply the agile stability very easily actually in this context. So I think that's why I mentioned that probably the first 2 chapters of the book are written more broadly. And I think, of course, we also, our own thinking evolved, I think, as well. But it's definitely, there is a way of having a volume 2, I guess, which is looking at public services and other areas. But yeah, Erkki, do you want to add here something as well?
Maybe one thing about this then is that when Rainer was mentioning infrastructure and building, and I think when you link and implying that there is like long-term investments and stuff like that, but I think what the concept, I guess, reminds us, first of all, is, that it's not only about agility, but it's also about the stability. But I think that any kind of transformative challenges ahead of us imply us also that we need to kind of think about what is the kind of duration or length of stability, or what is actually the time frame, right? So, infrastructure building is long-term investments and so on, but so are pension systems, right? So if you want to offer something to the generations now, then but then you need to seriously ask what you can offer for them, right? So it's not about sort of saying that we know how much your pension will be in 50 or 60 years time, which is kind of impossible to offer, but you can offer some sort of trust or in institutions and say that we don't know what the kind of pension system will look in 50 years time, but trust us that we will deliver some basic services for you. So I think that's also kind of, the framing you can put agile stability into that. We are actually constantly learning and evolving and see how new technologies, how new financial instruments or whatnot might enable or not us. But even if we make mistakes on this pathway, that we will still offer you this. And I think in a lot of cases, when it comes to, for example, sustainability or social services and so on, I think we have lost this trust building mechanism in governance, that we don't actually have a way to say that, we are learning, we are experimenting, we are making mistakes, but in the middle, we will guarantee some sort of a long-term view. So I think that might have to be reinforced. And this is also the way you can actually keep that concept alive or in the center of things.
I just wanted to quickly add that I think it's interesting how in the wake of Trump, there's actually a very lively debate around state capacity now, partially because of not only realizing that the state capacity can be really undermined very quickly in some instances when you have huge or very powerful democratic backsliding, but also, of course, thinking about how can we rebuild, and in what image do you want to rebuild it? What is it that you are rebuilding? If you have better leaders again in charge, what are you rebuilding? What kind of organizations are you rebuilding, and how do you understand whether you're doing a good job? And I think this is where this focus on capacities and capabilities and trying to actually evaluate them in a proper way, I think plays a huge role. Because in some ways, of course, the variant or the original version is also a trick, right? It doesn't tell you what capacities and capabilities matter as long as you know how you get them, which is namely through examination systems, right? So you just try to make sure that you get kind of decent people into the office, and that the rest of it takes care of it. And I think, of course, as we live in very multicultural societies, this does not hold anymore, really, because we don't anymore have this kind of homogeneous elite, really. So it's very difficult to generate this kind of trust that we elect a few thousand people who run our country for us. That's very difficult to hold for a very long time, because you can in many ways see the Trumpian revolution exactly in that form, because that trust has been undermined very heavily. And so we probably can't just rebuild a Weberian system. We need to have new elements to that. It actually is much more diverse, for instance. But it's also, yeah, much more sort of attuned to the politics, to what is happening in the social media space, and actually deals with that. And so it's interesting to see how there are both in the UK and US, because of the backsliding threats, you see very lively debate around what does it mean to build capabilities in public organizations. And of course, I think Brazil is very much in part of that debate as well.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much. Ana, João, vocês gostariam de acrescentar algo? Porque não temos pergunta, ou vamos para o encerramento?
I'm good.
Eu gostaria de colocar uma indagação apenas, que é a seguinte. Eu até comentei no chat de que, no caso da burocracia ligada à inovação, o exame dessa burocracia é mais fácil. Eu me pergunto se não seria também adequado pensar na burocracia de implementação das políticas, o que nós chamamos de burocracia no nível da rua, at the street level. E se, então, essa reflexão não poderia incluir também, como desdobramento, um entendimento dessa burocracia que, na verdade, é responsável pela implementação dos grandes guidelines da política de ciência e tecnologia.
A palavra está com vocês, os autores.
Yeah, just to quickly add, it's of course an excellent question in many ways, because you could argue that the discretion of street-level bureaucrats is particularly important. The way they understand wider political and policy mandates and how do they implement that is, of course, really key to the learning of any sort of policy system, whether you talk about science and technology, whether you talk about universities or you talk about social services. If the street-level bureaucracy is not learning or doesn't have the capabilities to learn quickly, then of course this is where a lot of things go wrong very quickly, and also the people upstairs don't really get the signals that things don't work. So I think again you can apply the sort of concept of agile stability quite nicely here. That of course the stable function is provided by competent civil servants being on the street level, but the agile function should be through how do they learn actually, what are the frameworks that they learn in, and how is that learning being fed up, and not in the sense of being fed up, but actually fed up the chain. So I think that's a very relevant question. I think in a way, if you look at the day-to-day functioning of bureaucracy, this is in many ways the number one question you will have to ask. How is the sort of the street level or the service facing level actually learning? And does anybody care what they learn?
I think I would add here only maybe one other element is that when you add to here the kind of ways or recent traditions, how we have designed our public services, right? And what is done by street level bureaucrats and what is procured in and stuff like that, one should sometimes even start with a question, where is learning happening? And if you think about sort of modern challenges or how we deal with technological change or what kind of sustainable technologies work and stuff like that, in many countries, your biggest problem might be that, learning happens in organizations that are not supposed to learn, and they are not feeding it back as well. So you're procuring in services or some delivery or some activities, and actually the learning happens in this kind of procured service providers, and they have never been contracted to feed back to the policymakers on what works, what doesn't, but just report on how many activities they did. So sometimes in order to enable this learning Rainer was talking about, we should also kind of think about what are the core activities of public sector and what are the kind of things that you can actually allow to contract out. And I always use in Estonia in civil service trainings this criteria is that, look at whatever you do and would you learn anything from it? If you as a policymakers would learn anything about it, at least some of it you need to keep at your arm's length in order to actually learn quick enough. And I think that's one of the key kind of reform elements we haven't really been paying attention when it comes to technology development or whatnot, that, are we actually understanding what happens within our policy domain, or we have lost the contact with that through procurements and other instruments? Maybe just this to add.
Yeah, and I would add very briefly, and here giving another perspective to what Rainer said about the pool of civil servants and the recruitment through exams. So I do think that when Weber would define meritocracy today, what he was talking about when he was talking about rational administration was, of course, an administration fully aware in and able to realize the values of the time, which in the last 1 or 2 years of Weber, and also according to what I see, does include DEI in a very important way. So to reduce Weber to a 19th century kind of meritocracy, rather than what is now also in the PA literature redefined as being actual merit, again opens the possibility to, if you will, back to the future to what looks like older systems, but with rejuvenated contents. So this is how I would see this as a possibility. And both on an extremely senior level and on the street level bureaucracies in the Gabriela Lotta kind of way, and everywhere in between. Thanks.
Excelente. Então, acho que podemos terminar, né? Já temos 1h30 de sessão, né? Acredito que é um tempo também bom para as pessoas verem depois no YouTube. Mais uma vez, eu agradeço os 3 autores, Rainer, Erkki, Wolfgang, agradeço o apoio da Ana Célia, né, nesse lançamento, a participação do João Carlos e todo o pessoal aqui de apoio que está nos ajudando, o pessoal da tradução simultânea. Excelente, e como a Ana colocou nas suas ponderações, o livro traz muita coisa e muita contribuição para o caso brasileiro, né? Eu já uso em minhas aulas, né? Eu acredito que a Enap também está incorporando isso, e a ideia é que a gente utilize, né, todo o framework e as reflexões, né, que os autores trazem para a gente melhorar muito o debate sobre o papel do Estado na inovação, do Estado empreendedor e o campo da administração e políticas públicas no Brasil. Então, agradeço também a presença de todos e todas que estão nos ouvindo. Até mais, pessoal.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandre. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.